Okay, we're going to get started. This seminar we're going to do is on syrup filtration. So we're going to talk a little bit about everything. We're talk about bags. We're going to talk about vacuum filters. We'll talk about filter presses. So we're going to talk a little bit about everything, where sugar, sand, and niter come from, and why we deal with it, why we want to take it out of our syrup. Okay, so we're going to talk about syrup filtration. So we often get the question, why is our syrup, cloudy if our sap is so clear? So really, what happens is, that cloudy appearance that we see in our finished maple syrup, is usually what we call sugar sand. Okay. So when we look at sugar sand, what is sugar sand and or niter? So basically, sugar sand is we're going to be looking at its parts of calcium and magnesium salts of maltic acid. And these salts form during the boiling process. So the minute that we take that crystal clear sap, that crystal clear liquid, the minute that we start to concentrate it or boil it, what happens is all of those minerals and calcium and magnesium and the salts, none of that material can stay in suspension anymore because we've started that evaporation process. So all of that material wants to precipitate out of that liquid. So that's why when we put heat to that nice, pristine, clear liquid, we go cloudy right away. And it really is the interaction of all of the stuff in the sap, the phenolic compounds, the amino acids, the salts, the magnesium, the calcium. It's really the interaction of all of that stuff that brings out that maple flavor. So one thing that we always see too, and a lot of people forget about, and I get an awful lot of questions about, is anytime we reheat maple syrup, if we go over 200 degrees, usually we'll create sugar sand or niter again. Okay. So we can take maple syrup that we filtered through a Orlon bag or a filter press, get it nice and crystal clear. And I didn't have time to bottle that syrup today. I let it sit until tomorrow. I put it on the stove. I bring it to a rolling boil. So we're up over 219. At that stage of the game, I developed that sugar sand or niter. I bottle that syrup, and that nice crystal clear syrup that I had prior to bottling is now got that cloudy or hazy appearance to it again. So, like I say, always keep in mind that even if we are filtered, if we do go over that 200-degree mark, we definitely do need to filter one more time just to make sure. So, what does sugar sand look like? Sugar sand, takes on a lot of different appearances, and it can do a lot of different things. So, we look at our sample over here. This particular bottle was filtered. This particular bottle here was left to sit for a shorter period of time. A lot of that material settled out on the bottom. And our third sample, we had a lot of material that settled out on the bottom. Plus, there's a lot of it that remained in suspension. It stayed hazy. It didn't have that nice crystal clear appearance to it. So sugar sand or niter will take a lot of different appearances when we look at it. Sometimes it'll look like a layer of dirt down on the bottom of a container. So when we tip that container over, we'll see that layer of kind of usually a darker or a blacker material down on the bottom of that container. Sometimes it will stay in suspension. It'll give the syrup a cloudy appearance. It won't have that nice crystal clear appearance that you can see through. Sometimes it'll stay in suspension. Sometimes that sugar sand will kind of float in a mass in that syrup, and it'll kind of stay in suspension, and it'll look like there's something wrong with the syrup, but it's just kind of floating in there. It never really settled all the way out to the bottom. Sometimes it may look very light and grainy, almost like beach sand, like this particular sample is here. So we've been boiling at our place for about the last week, kind of off and on as we've needed to. And I can honestly say that this first run stuff that we're processing at our place over at Anigo is very similar to this. It is a real grainy sugar sand, and there is a train wreck of it. The sugar sand was so thick it plugged the preheater on my evaporator. So I'll just give you that that indication. We've never made syrup this early, so I don't know if it's something to do with the year, but it's been an interesting time trying to process some of this very early sap so far. Okay, so why do we filter? Okay, it's we filter really kind of for several reasons. So a number of years ago, the IMSI, which is the International Maple Syrup Institute, passed some criteria for maple syrup production. And a lot of it had to do with flavor and color grade and light transmittance and the minimum bricks that maple syrup needs to be. So in this whole best practices package that was adopted really by every state really in North America, in just about every Canadian province, there were some descriptions or some quality control things that have to do with filtering when it comes to the definition of pure maple syrup. So the first one that we look at, of course, is the taste needs to be associated with the color of the syrup. And that was really when we, here in Wisconsin, when we adopted the IMSI grading standards as the state standard, really that was the first piece of the puzzle that we adopted. So the second one is free from objectionable odors and off flavors. Okay, we want to make sure that we're putting a quality maple product out there that isn't buddy, that isn't bitter, that isn't scorched or off flavored, whatever the case may be. And really the third bullet point that I wanted to highlight here is it needs to be free from turbidity or sediment, which really does mean that our syrup does need to be filtered if we're going to sell it as a grade A product. So when we talk about taste and flavor of syrup, sugar sand and niter in our syrup can bring a lot of off flavors into our syrup. Okay, so when we look at some of the off flavors that when we have sugar sand or niter in maple syrup, if we are making syrup on a small flat pan, and the flames are coming up alongside the pan, and the sides of our pan are hot, and as the syrup boils, we kind of splash up on the side and we burn on the surface of that pan. We'll pick up that scorch flavor, and a lot of that will be in our sugar sander that's in our syrup. We'll pick up that burnt flavor as well, and we can also pick up some bitter off flavors and some slight buddy off flavors in that sugar sand as well. So when we filter our syrup, we're not just taking out the sugar sand. There is a lot of opportunity to remove some of those not so pleasant flavors. I'm not saying we're going to get rid of them all, because Lord knows we can't, but we can get rid of the sugar sand, which does contain some of these flavors. The primary reason that we want to filter that syrup is if we leave that sugar sand in there, like I had mentioned before, a lot of times sugar sand will take on that grainy or that sandy appearance. When we have that sandy material left in our syrup, when we take a taste of that syrup, we'll get kind of a gritty taste in our mouth or a sandy taste in our mouth. And that's really kind of an objectionable taste that a customer doesn't want. So we want to make sure that we get that really removed from our maple syrup. So like I say, when we talk about free of turbidity and sediment, we want to make sure that we're getting that bottle of syrup nice and clear. We don't want to be putting stuff like this out for our consumers. Okay, so when we talk about methods of syrup filtration, years ago there was an old method. You'd let the syrup sit, you would pour the good syrup off or take the good syrup off the top, and the sludge or whatever was left in the bottom, we would do something different with or discard. Well, that really isn't the case much today. We work really hard to make this maple syrup. We don't want to throw any of it away if we don't have to. So we don't really see a lot of that settling or letting it set and settle out anymore. So for those of you that find YouTube as a great source of information, sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. You will find some recipes for getting rid of sugar sand or niter out there on YouTube, with mixing up some cream, some egg whites, and some milk, pouring that into your boiling syrup and letting it all kind of coagulate up to the surface and skimming it off. We would probably recommend that you don't do that anymore. The problem that we have today is, 1 in 8 people have food allergies. So my generation, people that are older than I am, we didn't really have a lot of food allergies, but you know, I have a son, and he's getting older now. But I'll never forget when we had him and about six of his little buddies spend the night at the house, and when the kids were getting dropped off, everyone that came into the door had a different tag pinned on them, that this one couldn't have milk, and that one couldn't have peanuts, and that one couldn't have tree nuts, and this one couldn't have bread, and so generations younger than myself have a lot more allergies to food. You know, so we want to make sure that we're keeping, you know, other food products, especially allergen, you know, containing products, out of our maple syrup. You know, so we're going to keep the dairy, and we're going to keep the eggs, and we're going to keep that material out of our maple syrup if we possibly can. And I'm going to talk a little bit about defoamer as long as we're at this section too. So if you are a licensed producer in the state of Wisconsin, you are required to use a approved maple defoamer. So we do sell the Atmos 3000 defoamer here, which is a great defoamer. We also sell the dry defoamer, which we used in the last demonstration when we were boiling some syrup. Both of them are approved maple defoamers. They both work very well. You know, like again, the days of throwing you know, a pat of butter into the pan, or a tablespoon of cream or something to knock the foam down, we probably shouldn't be doing that, like say with food allergies anymore. So filter bags are a real common method for the hobbyists to filter their maple syrup. I mean, we used them for years and years at our facility when we were a smaller producer. Vacuum filters have come into the market over the last number of years as an alternative to a filter bag, and a lower price point than a filter press. So vacuum filters have become relatively popular in the hobby market because it does offer a little better way of filtering with a little better success. And then, of course, our best way of filtering, or the Cadillac of filtering, will be our pressurized filter press, and using that filter aid material, which is DE powder. So that's really our options as far as filtration goes. So we're going to talk a little bit about filter bags to get started. That's really going to be where we're going to start. Filter bags can come in a variety of different ways. We can, you know, they'll come in the cone style filters. We can have them in flat filters like you see on the top of this bottling kit. So the filters can, like say, take on a couple different shapes along with the pre-filters. They can be flat, they can be cone shaped. When we talk about filters, it's commonly referred to as gravity filtering when we filter with filter bags. Bags are usually made out of wool, Orlon, or felt. Really, by today's standard, Orlon is the most common. We really do not see a lot of Orlon or felt bags being placed into service today. Like saying the material is mostly Orlon. Um, Bags can be used with or without pre-filters. Pre-filters will definitely increase the performance and increase the volume. A lot of the sugar sand will stay inside the pre-filter instead of plugging up the surface of the filter bag itself. New filter bags should be washed prior to using. You know, when we wash a filter bag, we're going to wash in hot water only. We're not going to wash with any bleach or any detergent. So if you've sat into one of my seminars, you probably heard me say this before. As a maple equipment salesperson, I get the task of trying everybody's maple syrup. So sometimes it's good, sometimes it's interesting. We'll just put it that way. So I stopped into a sugar house, visiting some customers on a evaporator, and they wanted me to taste test their syrup, of course. You know, so you know, the first thing you usually do when you're taste testing a sample of syrup is you smell it, and you know, you could smell this kind of perfumy, you know, smell coming from that syrup, and well, this could be interesting. So I, you know, gave it a good smell, and reluctantly took that first taste, and took another taste, and you could pick up that soapy flavor to it. You know, you could tell it was washed somewhere, or someplace that had soap. You know, so I asked them what their procedure was, and they said, well, that's, you know, what we do is we rinse the filter bag out, and we got a couple of them, we throw them in the washing machine without any soap, and we just wash them in hot water that way. Well, there's enough soap residue in that maple syrup, or in that washing machine, I should say, that really, you know, transfers into that filter bag. And then when they filtered their syrup through it, we could pick up that smell and that flavor of that detergent, or that laundry soap that was in there. So, like I say, we want to make sure that we're washing these, like say, in hot water only. Um, Filter bags should be dampened before use. So when I talk about dampening a filter bag, I'm not talking about, you know, pulling it out of a bucket of water and have it dripping wet. It should be dampened, okay, before use. We don't want to have it so wet that when we pour the syrup through it, especially if it's a small batch, that we're changing the bricks of our maple syrup that we're pouring through there, because we're pulling that water out of that filter bag. So it should be dampened before use, kind of conditions the bag and gets it ready to use. Like I say, not too much water. Wash, like I say, hot water only, no bleach, no soaps, nothing like that. So if your filter is stiff, if that filter is stiff, it wasn't clean when it got put away, it should be discarded. Once the filters get to that point, it's hard to get them back and get them to work effectively. So thread-bearing old filter bag should be replaced. Basically, if that bag is starting to separate, the pores of that fabric are starting to come apart, and we're going to start to see some sugar sand and niter pass through that filter bag. One thing, when you're getting water or washing that filter bag, squeeze the water out of it. Don't twist it and wring it, because all we're going to do is we're going to tear all the fabrics in those filter bags. So we don't want to wring the water out of them. We want to squeeze it out and then let them air dry. So like say that we're not tearing that fabric in there. Give your filter bag the sniff test, as funny as this may sound. What do we know about maple syrup? Maple syrup really picks up every flavor that it comes in contact with. So if you put that filter bag away and it was a little damp, wasn't quite dry, you put it into a bag or a sealed up little tote in your basement or in your closet, and you open that up and you smell that filter bag and it's got a musty smell or a mildewy smell to it because it got put away wet, you're going to have that flavor or that smell transfer into your syrup. So like I say, give it kind of the sniff test, make sure that we don't have that moldy or that mildewy smell coming into that filter bag. Like say, like get them filter bags completely dry before they're stored. Although, like say, otherwise we're going to have some issues with them. So we're going to talk a little bit about vacuum filters, and vacuum filters have come onto the market over the last 5 to 6 years. They are a really good fit for a lot of hobby producers. They fit in a price point kind of between a filter bag and a filter press, and it gives you an opportunity to have something that you can also use as a bottler as well. So they've been a pretty good filter for us. We sell quite a pile of them every year. So the first thing that happens is we apply vacuum to the underside. So the syrup is poured up here in the top, and it is separated by a gasket, a filter, and a pre-filter. So we're applying vacuum to this lower chamber with a shop vac. And what that's doing is that's helping draw that syrup through that pre-filter and that Orlon disc. Okay. So one of the things that I will say, I won't call sugar makers cheap, but they are definitely thrifty. Get a clean shop vac, get a new one, and dedicate it for this use. Don't take the one you vacuumed the garage floor with and then hook on to your vacuum filter. So unfortunately, we see all kinds of equipment that gets repurposed in our industry. So like I say, we always just throw that out there as a word of caution. So, okay. So the filter is usually used with an Orlon disc, and it's also used with a pre-filtering disc. So that sits on top. The top is then clamped on, and there's a rubber gasket underneath that creates the seal to let us have the vacuum come out. Syrup is poured in basically at the top of the filter. We have a dial thermometer on the bottom that makes sure that we can keep our syrup at a minimum temperature of 180 degrees for bottling. The nice thing with this particular little vacuum filter, it comes all in kind of a kit. It's got the dial thermometer included with it. It's got a valve on the bottom with a draw-off elbow, and it's got a tapered floor in the bottom so it drains completely out. This particular unit can be set on a gas burner of a stove or an electric burner of a stove, and it can help keep your syrup warm after you get it filtered so you can bottle it. So it serves kind of multiple purposes, not only as a filter, we can also use it for bottling to make sure that we got that syrup at the correct temperature when we start to bottle. Okay, the other thing is if we get some syrup that is tough to filter, so sometimes, we can filter through an Orlon bag or a Orlon filter using a pre-filter, We'll get the syrup through and we still got a haziness to it. We just can't quite get it cleaned up. The nice thing with the vacuum filter is we can use a small amount of DE powder if we have some hard to filter syrup. Now this thing isn't a miracle container. It's not, it's not that. Here in central Wisconsin, when we get into the first and second week of April and we get towards late season and syrup is hard to filter, it's going to be just as hard to filter with this as is an Orlon bag. So probably 99% of the filtration questions that I get during syrup season are people that are making syrup after they should have quit. Okay. Just because the sap, last spring is a great example. We had, at our place, we had a foot and a half or 2 feet of snow on the ground yet. It went 80 degrees for several days, and then it cooled right back off and snowed and did a whole bunch of stuff, and everybody fired back up. Syrup's crystal clear, it's perfect, whatever the case may be. Well, that day my phone started ringing off the wall. How come I can't filter the syrup? How come I can't filter the syrup? Well, season has passed. We're to the point. We're to the point. We're to the point. Once that tree has, last year was kind of a perfect storm. We'll just touch on this. There's two ways a maple tree breaks dormancy. One is hours of daylight. Two is heat. Okay, so last year was a perfect storm. We were cold all spring. We didn't get much of a sap run. We went to 80 degrees right away. But when we went to 80 degrees, it was in April, that second week of April. So the cards were stacked against us. It was hot, and the hours of daylight were long enough. That tree, boom, it broke dormancy, and that was it. So a lot of times we get the filtration questions coming on that late season syrup. And it doesn't matter if you have a filter bag, a vacuum filter, or a filter press. We just get to the point where we can't filter syrup anymore. We can make it, but we just can't get it filtered anymore. That's just the long and the short of it. So, okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about pressure filters and filter presses. So, how does everybody filter? Filter bags? Couple? Okay, anybody using a vacuum filter? Couple vacuum filters, filter presses?
20-inch.
Okay, so we got a smattering of everybody that's got a little different thing going on, which is good. We're going to talk about them all, I guess. So when we look at basically a filter press, we're going to have the suction side of our pump, and we're going to draw our DE powder or our diatomaceous earth mixed with our maple syrup in through the suction side of our pump. And then basically we're going to discharge out of the suction side of that pump, and we're going to put it into our pressurized filter press. So we're going to go through a little bit of how a filter press works and what's going on in the internals. So there are really kind of three parts, other than the pump, of course, of that filter press. There are a couple other parts of that filter press. So the first one we have is over here on the left is a waffle plate. Okay, so that's one of the plates that's inside of our filter press. We have our paper, which goes between our waffle plate and our hollow frame plate. Okay, so we have our waffle plate, our paper, and our hollow frame plate. So that is really the three components of the filter press that are really kind of in play that we're going to talk about. So really, this is what our filter press is going to look like when it is assembled. We have the wider portion, which is our frame. We have our paper, and then we have our waffle plate. And we have a paper, we have our open frame, paper, waffle plate. And that's how that is assembled and stacked together. So when we look at a filter press and how it works, there are really two ports on the bottom of each plate and frame, and that really comes down to what's going on internally inside of the filter press. So now if I am standing in front of my filter press and my press motor is behind me and my press is facing forward and I'm looking at my filter press, basically the left-hand side of my filter press, or this left-hand opening down on the bottom, that is my clean syrup passage, okay? The right-hand side of my plate and frame will be the dirty syrup side of my filter press, okay? So this side of when you put all these together, all these form that open channel. So the dirty syrup is running down the right-hand side of the filter press. And as it's getting filtered, the clean syrup then exits on the left-hand side of the filter press. So what's going on internally inside of that filter press? So the dirty syrup side of the filter press, this is our hollow frame. The dirty syrup is coming through our right-hand port, and there is a passage that is drilled from here to here, kind of where I'm aiming right there. And basically that passage is where our incoming syrup with mixed with our DE powder goes, okay? So there is a paper that covers each side of that open frame. Our syrup is entering that frame down through the bottom, and what that does is that fills that cavity in the inside of that filter press with DE powder, syrup, and sugar sand. And it stays inside of that cavity. So when a filter press is started, of course, we mix some DE powder in with our maple syrup. Once we start to draw that DE and syrup mixture into our filter press, we should recirculate that. We should take our clean syrup discharge hose and put back into that same container. And we should let it run or coat all the papers in the inside of that filter press with DE powder. Once them papers are coated with DE powder, that syrup coming out of that hose will be nice and crystal clear. And you'll be able to see it. Once that hose is running clear, then we can put it in the barrel or the barrel or the bottle or whatever the case may be. But we need to recirculate that. So the reason I'm talking about this is if you read some filter press manuals, it'll tell you in the filter press manual that you can go through and you can charge your filter press with DE powder using hot water. You can do that as an option. You can pump that water DE powder mix into your filter press to coat your papers. But please keep in mind that if you do use that procedure, there's a lot of water that is left inside of that filter press. And if you're filtering a very small batch of syrup, it can possibly change your Brix level of your maple syrup. Okay, so you could have syrup that is, say, our minimum for maple syrup, of course, is 66 Brix. Say I put some maple syrup into my filter press. I had just a small batch, 2 or 3 gallons. I pumped it through my filter press. Of course, I loaded my press with water and DE. I drained my water out. There's still a lot of water left inside that press. I pumped that 67 Brix maple syrup in there. There could be enough water in that filter press that it drops me below 66 Brix. So just keep in mind, if you are going to load that press with water and DE powder, that we check the Brix of that outcoming syrup to make sure that we didn't thin it down too much, that we're below that minimum 66 Brix level that we're looking for. So, okay. So with that being said, we can really tell how good of a job that we're doing running our filter press by what the cake looks like. Okay, and this cake will develop inside of that hollow frame. Okay, basically what happened in this illustration is we took the hollow cavity plate out, we took the paper off each side, and we pressed out that solid cake of DE powder and sugar sand. Okay, so a lot of times what we see in a filter press is when we break that press apart, we'll see a small layer or a small coating of DE powder and sugar sand and or niter on our papers, and the rest of the cavity will be hollow and filled with syrup. Okay, so if we're running our press correctly, this is what we should see. Okay, now the question I always get, and I do not have the correct answer to because every batch of syrup filters differently, is how much DE powder do I use? And when you take your press apart, if you're not seeing a cake similar to this, odds are, not always, odds are you have not used enough DE powder. Okay. Now, the question I get is how do I know if I'm using too much DE powder? Well, that's a little easier one to answer. What I can do is I can take that cake and I can cut it open with a knife. And if I slice through that cake of DE powder, or that cake that came out of that plate, if it is really white in the inside, I used probably too much DE powder because I have DE powder that really didn't take on any of that sugar sand from that syrup. So like I say, if I cut that apart and it's really white in the inside, there's a good possibility I might be using a little too much. So it doesn't hurt nothing. It just takes your capacity of your press down. Yep, how many gallons you can get through it. So basically, when the syrup passes into that open cavity, into that hollow plate, travels through that layer of DE powder that is on top of the paper, travels through the paper itself, that syrup then goes up against this waffle plate. Okay? So when the syrup hits that waffle plate, I'm going to wait till he shuts the door there. There are a series of small holes. There's 3 holes here and 3 holes here. And these series of small holes are drilled into this port, which is going to be on the left-hand side of our filter press, which is the clean syrup side of our filter press. So what happened basically is the syrup travels down these little channels in the waffle plate, and it's basically traveling over to the area of low pressure over here to the left-hand side, and all of the syrup is working its way down, and it's exiting the press over there on the left-hand side. A couple things. We're going to go back. So I filter a lot of syrup, and I don't know if it's just me, but we have a tremendous amount of sugar, sand, and niter at our sugar house. We've always have, ever since I've been a kid making syrup. When we clean our filter press, we need to pay attention to a couple things. We need to watch this port here because we're pumping that syrup that is completely filled with sugar sand through that port. We will start to see buildup on that port, so we need to make sure that we're keeping that channel clean. The other thing that we need to pay attention to is we need to look at keeping that channel clean as well. That goes from the dirty syrup passage to the inside of that hollow plate. We do get some phone calls from people in the spring, that actually plug these holes up right here in between. They'll plug this up with sugar sand. When they go to take their press apart, they'll find that that cavity is empty and there is no syrup inside of that cavity, or nothing got filtered in that cavity. No syrup could get into that cavity because this port got plugged. If it isn't plugged today, it could be plugged tomorrow because, like say, they smoke over time. That sugar, sand, and niter accumulate, and the hole gets smaller, gets smaller, gets smaller. So kind of be mindful that we're keeping this port clean, the bigger port and this side port. We don't really see a lot of build up here. This is on the clean side of the filter press, for lack of better terminology. So we've removed the majority of the sugar sand at that point. So we really don't see these holes plug up very often, but it's just a couple things to kind of keep in mind when you're running that filter press. So a couple tips and tricks with filter presses. One is we want to make sure that we are using a food grade DE powder. Okay, going down to the swimming pool store and grabbing a bag of DE powder, there are differences in the DE powder. We need to make sure that we're using a product that is meant for food contact. Okay, DE powder is considered a processing aid when we are processing our maple syrup. That's how the state statutes and organic certification look at it, as a processing aid. So like I say, we need to make sure that we are using a material that is approved for food contact. Keep syrup temperature over 180 degrees for the press, but try to keep it under 200 if we possibly can. What do we know about sugar, sand, and niter? If my syrup is over 200 degrees, even passing through my filter press, if it's 216 degrees discharging out of my filter press, it can generate sugar, sand, and niter again because it's over 200. So even if I ran it through that filter press at that extremely high temperature, say right out of the evaporator pan and through the filter press, there is a possibility that I will have sugar, sand, or niter appearing in that syrup, whether it's in a barrel or a container. I'll be really honest with you, I do not have good luck bottling syrup right off our evaporator. Our evaporator makes syrup pretty quick. Our syrup coming through our filter press is always hot. And if I try to bottle right off that evaporator, a lot of times I'll make cloudy syrup if I try to package because I'm coming off just a little too hot. Okay, a lot of the filter presses have a 3-way valve or a diverter valve on it. So this valve will allow you to use your pump on your filter press as a transfer pump, excuse me, to pump syrup out of a barrel or pump syrup into a pan or transfer syrup. Works very well for that. There's usually a hose hooked onto the onto the third barb of this particular port on that pump. The thing that people don't realize, especially if you're running an older filter press that may have an electric motor with a gear pump that isn't variable speed, or if you're using one of these new electric diaphragm pumps on your filter press, I use the air pump where I can control my pump speed. On the electric ones, we cannot control the pump speed. So there's a lot of times that pump is chugging along and chugging along, and it's throwing a large volume of syrup to your filter press. The problem is we start to build up pressure inside of that filter press. It looks like it should be cleaned, but if I slow my flow down just a little bit and I put that syrup into that filter press at a little bit slower rate, I will be able to filter more syrup through that filter press before I change it. So one way that you can cheat if you've got an electric pump is this diverter valve usually has a hose attached to it. At least it does on our press for transferring syrup. I can stick that hose back into my tank and I can crack that diverter valve and let that pump run wide open. So say, for example, I'm running a 7-inch filter press with an electric pump. My pressure is getting up to 40 degrees or 40 pounds, and I know that I just cleaned this press not that long ago. I can divert, or I can crack open that valve and I can take a little of that pressure and I can send it out that bypass hose back into my tank. I can slow the flow of syrup down to that filter press and I can filter more volume through there. It's just a way to, it's just a one way to cheat and stretch a little more volume through that filter press before you clean it. So what we do, like say at our facility, is we have a air pump on our filter press, and our filter press sits right on our draw off tank right next to our evaporator. I turn on my filter press pump as slow as it will run, and as my syrup is, we got a fairly steady stream of syrup that comes out of our evaporator. It just runs out of the evaporator into the draw off tank. I leave that pump just tick along slow, and it runs right through the filter press. So it's going through my filter press hot, but at a very low volume. So last night, for example, at our sugar house, I made 255-gallon barrels of syrup on a 10-inch press. And when I quit at the end of the night, my pressure on my 10-inch press after doing 2 barrels was only 30 psi. So there's a little bit to be said about slowing that volume down into that filter press and the capacity that you can get through it. So, okay. If you want to use your filter press for bottling applications and you don't want to, say you've got a long bank press and you just want to filter some syrup that you've already filtered, you don't want to load that whole filter press up with papers and plates. They do offer some blank plates. We have them here in stock for like the Westfab 7s and 10s that you can take your long bank press and turn it into a short bank press by adding a block off plate in there, so that if you want to filter just a small batch of syrup, you don't end up with a filter press full of syrup. You can just do 2 or 3 plates and frames. You can shut off a good section of that filter press. So that is some parts that we do offer for sale. They do work pretty well. Say for example, if your press is filled up, you're running your evaporator and you've only got like say 4 or 5 more gallons of syrup to filter, you don't necessarily have to clean your whole filter press. You could clean like say three empty frames or 3 frames. Clean 3 frames, put new papers in that half of the filter press, add a little bit of DE powder, recirculate that hose back into the tank until the syrup runs clean, and then finish filtering just those few gallons and only clean either a third or a half of your filter press. So just a few things. You don't have to clean the whole press. You can always do that. Usually if syrup is filtering hard, especially late in the year, if we're not building that full solid cake in that hollow cavity, there's a very good possibility we don't have enough DE powder. So that is just a good rule of thumb. So one of the things that is coming into the filter press market is what they call an air in and air out kit. So CDL's really end goal with a lot of their equipment going forward is to really fully automate the sugar house. So, right now, as of today, we have our monitoring systems, we have our fully automated ROs, we have a Master E electric evaporator, which is a fully automated evaporator that you don't even need to be in the building to have it run. The only thing that we're having a struggle with is automating the filtering process. So this is one of the devices that is starting to show up to extend the run cycle or to cut down on the cleaning of the filter presses. So like I mentioned before in the process, there's a lot of times, mid to late season, we'll run that filter press, we'll knock it apart to clean it, and we'll just have a small layer of DE powder and sugar sand on the papers, but yet our pressure came up to the point where we can't get any more liquid through that press. So one of the kits that CDL has come with, you can order them on new presses from the factory this way. This is a retrofit kit, and I'm going to be kind of the guinea pig here. This is my filter press. So what we're looking at is we're coming up with different ways to, one, evacuate the syrup out of the press prior to cleaning so that we don't have as much waste. And the second thing that we're looking at doing is coming up with a way to agitate that DE powder and sugar sand to get it off that paper, to agitate it, for lack of better terminology, inside that hollow cavity and increase the runtime of that filter press. So what the kit does is it puts filtered compressed air into the pressure side. So this valve is going to sit between our filter press and our pump. So what we would do is we would put air into that side of the filter press. We would evacuate the syrup out of the filter press. Okay, low pressure filtered air. Over on the clean side of our filter press, which is our left-hand side, we would have another valve and pressure regulator and air inlet that would go on that side. So once we evacuate the syrup from that filter press, what we're going to do is we're going to put clean filtered air backwards through our filter press, which is going to basically pressurize the opposite side of our paper on our waffle plate, and it should peel off the DE powder and the sugar sand that's on that plate, get it to fall down inside of that plate. Once we do that, we're going to shut the air off on the filter press. We're going to turn our pump back on, and what we're going to do is we're going to put our clean discharge hose back into the tank when it starts running clean again without adding any DE powder. We're going to let it run until it runs clean, and then we can start the filtration process again. So this is a way to kind of increase the runtime of the filter press without cleaning it. So what that's going to look like is on a 10-inch press here, it's kind of hard to see. This is the pump. This is the inlet to the press that is going to sit right here. On a 10-inch press, this basically got installed right where the gauge port was. We've got our gauges, we've got our air regulators and everything here to take care of our incoming air. And then on the discharge side of our filter press, we have the valve here and we have the air regulators and gauges where we put air in backwards through the filter press. So this is something that we could order on new filter presses for probably about the last 18 months. And it's something that we're going to look at offering as a retrofit kit for, filter presses probably starting this summer into next fall. So like I say, just a way to get a little bit more runtime, like say, out of that filter press. And like say, and this is coming from CDL's, kind of their whole vision of basically fully automating that sugar house to get it to the point where, we don't have to have anybody in that facility for 5 or 6 hours while the syrup's being produced. They can be out, walking lines, checking for leaks, whatever the case may be. So like say, when we, it's very simple to run. There's just a couple of quick valves. Basically, we're going to turn a series of valves. It's going to allow us to put the air into the, evacuate the syrup out of the press, put air back into the press, and then basically shut a pair of valves and restart. So it's going to be something that can be done very simple and very quickly, in the process while you're filtering syrups. So any questions on filtration? Yep. Will a filter aid work with gravity? The filter, gravity filter? It's really hard to, because once that layer of sugar sand gets on top of the DE, it just stops. We don't have the vacuum like on a vacuum filter, or we don't have the pressure. And when we use DE powder with a vacuum filter, we use it on the pre-filter. So we keep that DE powder on the pre-filter. We keep it out of the Orlon because once we get it into the Orlon, it's tough to get it out of there. So, yep. My crystal ball's broken. So, it all depends on the batch of syrup and the size of the press. Every batch is different. So um, that 8 ounce Cool Whip container, I've got one of those scoops about that size in my DE bag. On my 10-inch press last night, to pre-charge that press, I got about 10, 15 gallons in my draw-off tank. I put in 6 of those scoops basically full, and that filtered me 2 barrels of syrup. So, and it made me by the time I was done, I had a nice solid cake in that press when I cleaned after 2 drums last night. But every batch, like I say, is going to be just a little bit different. I mean, I've already had years where I never put DE powder in. There was so much sugar sand it would build a cake with just the sugar sand. Yeah, and every one is different. Like say because you don't want to load it up too full because you don't want to cut down on that capacity to hold that sugar sand in that hollow cavity. So like say I always usually say we want to build a good cake. Cut the cake. Let's look at it. Let's make sure we don't it's not half of it's white or 3/4 of it's white because then I definitely used way too much filter aid. So yep. Nope. No, once that press is, for us, once that press is loaded, we keep right on filtering. Yep. We don't add. So we added that initial load of DE powder right off the bat, and then we never added any more to it. Now, I will say that works nice on early season syrup usually, but when we get to late season syrup, it doesn't hurt to add a little splash because when you open up that filter press and you look at that layer of material that's on that paper, sometimes it looks almost shiny and greasy. And if we can add a little bit of DE powder every once in a while, especially on late season syrup, it kind of rejuvenates that surface and doesn't let it plug up tight to the point where we can't get any more liquid through it. So I would say probably at our place, the first 3/4 of the season we add at the front side only, and we don't add. But when syrup becomes difficult to filter, then we're putting a little splash in every now and again to try and keep it going. So, but that's usually getting into April, so which is a long time from now. Yep. So we a lot of times we shut our press off when it's 75, 80 pounds. We take it right up to the top because I don't like changing my filter press. So but yeah, that's where we usually end up. Probably around 75 pounds is when we start to look to change. Because there's a fair bit of filtering capacity left when you're at 30, 35 pounds yet. There's a fair bit of filtering capacity left there if you slow that flow down. But if you run that pump wide open and you try to force it in there, good luck. It's open up that diverter valve and let some of that go around the bypass if you can. So yep. The vacuum filter, how easy is that to when the filter plugs up? How easy is it to change out and keep filter? Like we're using bags now. So yep. So what we do usually with the container on top of that filter does not hold a lot of material. So usually when that container runs down, we usually tell people that's run 1 or 2 sets like that through it and then clean it. Don't wait till the point where we can't get it completely out because it's not like you can just tip it over. You got clean syrup in the bottom. You need to get that out of there and get it bottled up or whatever. So yep. Not much. And the thing is with filter presses, you're not wasting it. So even in our bottling room, say for example, when I clean my filter press in the bottling room, we break it open. I've got a long bank 7 when we bottle, and there's a fair bit of syrup that's left in that press. We save all that. We put that into a 5-gallon container that goes in the fridge, and the next batch of syrup that we do, we pour that right back in. We never throw that away. And our rinse water out of there, goes in there too. And like say we boil it up, and like say we try not to waste anything if we can. So you don't need a whole lot. And if you want to, and if you have an existing filter press, you can buy that blank plate, and you can run that as a two hollows and a waffle. I mean, you can run that just really short if you got just a small volume of syrup that you want to filter. You could I mean, you could be as low, if you went just short with that blocking device inside that press, a couple gallons.
Then can it sit like if you're boiling and let's say take a couple gallons an hour?
Mm-hmm.
I run a couple gallons and it sit for an hour or two while I get the next couple of gallons.
It's going to be tough once that temperature drops in that filter press. It's tough to get it restarted. I know a lot of times, like at our place, we can change our syrup pans in about 20 minutes, and there's a lot of instances that in that 20-minute time span, that press cools off to the point where we've got to change that press. So, yeah. Yep. Anything else on filtration? The problem with RO water is it gets crappy. When you store it for that long of time. So RO water is loaded with bacteria. It is by far clean water. We had a conversation yesterday in the seminar. When it came to filtering, I had a gentleman say, "Well, I take my filter bags and I dampen them up with my RO water because that's nice clean water." Well, it's not. So in Wisconsin, RO water is classified as wastewater. So if you are a licensed producer in the state of Wisconsin, if you have a license and you're running an RO, you are supposed to have a low volume discharge permit from the Wisconsin DNR to discharge that RO water on top of the ground. Okay, so the problem that we run into with RO water, and we tried, we gave it our college best effort, for lack of better terminology. We sanitized everything right up to our membranes and right behind them because we can't get chlorine in our membranes because that's a bad day. And we tried to get a clean water sample to pass coming out of that machine. It don't happen. This is not like a home RO system where you pass the safe water test already and you're just taking out the solids out of your water, whatever the case may be. Our RO water is loaded with bacteria, and if that stuff sits for a week and a half, it's just absolutely slimy. So if you read the regulations that the state of Wisconsin's got put out, we're only allowed to store RO water as a licensed facility. I believe it's for less than 24 hours. I think I may be a little rusty on my statute on how that's written, but I'm almost positive we can only keep that on site for less than 24 hours. And we can only really use it to wash non-contact food surfaces like walls and floors and different things like that. So yeah, keeping permeate around, it's going to get pretty white and pretty slimy pretty quick because it's going to have to be stored above freezing. So